Hello, welcome to week 5. This week we are studying the physiology of stress. So, diving deeper than we did in week 1, just asking simply what is stress and talking a little bit about the fight or flight, Cannon's fight or flight, and Selye's model. We're actually going to dive deeper into what specifically happens in the physiology, in our physiology when we are under stress. Now, weeks 5 and 6 are actually together. It's the physiology of stress and stress and illness. So, understanding that all of what is in week 5 and 6, even though they're divided up by modules, you kind of get that whole time period to do both of those weeks. I hope that makes any sense. So, you can ask me if it doesn't. All right, so I'm going to put myself down here in the corner and let's start talking a little bit more about this physiology of stress. So I want you to think for just a moment. Imagine for just a moment that you're in the twilight of sleep, that little place where you're kind of half awake, half asleep, and a loud bang against your window suddenly awakens you. What do you think happens in your brain? Well, you can imagine what happens in your body, right? I don't know. For me, I would be startled awake potentially, and my heart might start racing. All of that kind of fight or flight stuff might happen if I hear that loud bang, and it would seem just automatic that it would happen. So kind of just imagine that, and what is actually, if we could go, we're going to go take a deeper dive into the body and figure out what happens in that moment. Okay, so first comes sensory awareness, and that's a little more complicated than it would sound. And because you're in the twilight of sleep, you're falling asleep. And so that sound, that bang of the window has to get through to wake you up and be considered important. So the brain has a very selective process. Remember, you got 87 billion neurons in there taking input, each of them from 10,000 other neurons at any given moment. How does the brain, I mean, just imagine getting that many texts in a second. How does you can't do it. Well, your phone would explode, but the brain would explode if it had to pay attention to all of that information that's coming in at one time. So it has to be selective about what it decides to pay attention to. So there has to be perception. You have to perceive something as important. The thalamus, a part of the brain called the thalamus, is very important in this. We call it the gatekeeper. So when sensory information, what you hear, smells, taste, see, feel, anything from your senses comes in through your body at any given moment. It's going to go, most of it, everything except the olfactory sense, it goes in through the thalamus first, and it's called the gatekeeper. It's going to decide what's important enough to pay attention to, in a way. And it's going to send the information um, to the part of the brain that's responsible for it. So visual stimuli will go to the visual cortex, auditory stimuli will go to the auditory centers, all that kind of stuff, right? So the thalamus is called the gatekeeper, and it kind of gets to determine what you actually perceive as important, and then the brain has to interpret and then integrate that information. So your brain has to make sense of it, that current situation, based on your past experiences. It might it might do a big scan of what's happened in the past, or that could be anything you've heard about, or if there's somebody, if there's kids in the neighborhood that you've heard, or kind of vandalizing or something, or I'm sorry, kids, it's not always kids. You're not kids, but I feel bad saying that about kids. But people in the neighborhood vandalizing or something, or there have been break-ins in the area or something, something in your brain that might cause you concern in that moment, um, might be filed through to see what kind of fits the moment. And if there's time, your higher thinking might come online, your thinky thoughts, very technical, and say, okay, does this make sense? Is this anything to be concerned about? Now, the thing about it is, we've talked a little bit about the amygdala and how it gets to ask the question, is this safe or not? There's kind of a back alley between the thalamus and the amygdala. The thalamus will typically also send information to the higher parts of the brain um, for better discernment and thought about what's going on. But there is a back alley to, if you would want to call it that, to the amygdala. And that's what we can call an amygdala hijack. So if there's something in your environment, this can happen, maybe another example might be you're walking down the trail and you're in your peripheral vision, there's this long object and your brain, goes through the information really quickly and it's like, it says threat, snake, um, long object. It's only getting partial information necessarily at that moment, and it may go that back alley to the amygdala, so that what do you do when you see a snake? You do your snake dance, um, rather than wait for it to get to the higher thinking, so that you can weigh the pros and cons and get bit by the snake before you've done all that. So the body does want to register things that it considers as threats pretty quickly and react to them, rather than having to think about them all the time. This is where we can get into trouble. So um, sometimes higher thinking is bypassed in these situations. If the brain tries to, interprets this as a threat, all the alarms go off, and the nervous and the endocrine systems respond, and we get fight or flight. So we're going to dive more deeply into the nervous and the endocrine systems and what actually happens inside of those if the brain has considered what's happening as threatening. You've perceived something, it's getting in through all of those messages, perceive something that seems threatening, the alarm goes off, and so now what actually is happening? Okay, so let's talk about the nervous system first. We have it in two parts. There's the central nervous system, which is the spinal column, which goes down your spine, and the four major brain regions, including the brainstem, the cerebellum, the diencephalon, which is going to consist of your thalamus and your hypothalamus, and the cerebral hemispheres. Those just two big parts of the brain on either side, divided by the corpus callosum, which we consider, the big parts of the brain. Thinking parts of the brain, the cortex. And then so that's the central nervous system. Then we have the peripheral nervous system. So it's on the periphery. It's not part of the brain and the brainstem exactly, the spinal column, but it is all the neural pathways that go to the extremities of your body. So that go into your arms, in through your organs, in through your legs. The somatic nervous system is going to supply nerves to, or innervates, so it excites the nerves in the muscles of the body that we move voluntarily. So if I want to move my arm to pick up my cup, the somatic nervous system is going to get those muscles of the body to move and do what I want them to do. The autonomic nervous system innervates the organs. Now, we don't do that consciously, right? So that's a little more involuntary. It sends nerves to the organs, and it includes the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems. We're going to dive more into each and all of these, okay, and all the different parts of them. So this is just an overview. The autonomic nervous system has two parts. The sympathetic, which is fight or flight, it activates, energizes us, and the parasympathetic, which is called rest and digest, which calms us. So it has the excitable one and the more relaxing one. And those are going to be more automatic than voluntary in a lot of that. But when we are when we are practicing things to manage stress, what we're actually trying to do is get into those systems, get into our nervous system, and especially activate our parasympathetic nervous system, strengthen it. Because in our society, it's the one that doesn't get as much attention. It's the problem with chronic stress when this becomes out of balance, and the sympathetic nervous system is always going, and kind of flipped on, and the parasympathetic system isn't getting activated. So a lot of our stress management techniques are all about activating our parasympathetic nervous system. For example, when practicing mindfulness, I asked you to slow down your exhale. The exhale is controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, not the inhale. So if we slow down the exhale, then we can more often activate that part of our nervous system, strengthen it, right? We're kind of building the muscle of it. Okay, that was an aside in a way. So the brain in three parts. We're going to talk about the brain in these three little parts. Now, you've heard about some of these before, but we're going to go into them a little bit more, right? Okay. So we have the vegetative level. It's also often called the lizard brain. It's the lowest level, and it includes the reticular formation, which is the link between the brain and the spinal cord. So in a way, the link between the mind and the body. The brainstem includes the pons, medulla oblongata, mesencephalon, or the midbrain, kind of same thing. Easier to say midbrain, so we might stick with that. And it more manages involuntary functions. Lizard brain has been around a long time. It's the oldest part of the brain. It is very instinctive and involuntary. Thank goodness that we don't have to think about activating all those systems that it works on, which we'll talk about. The limbic system. Oh, let me do this. If you took your hand and you made a fist in which you have your thumb inside, this vegetative level, if you open your hand, is all of this. We think of this as the brain stem and the kind of deeper parts of the brain there at the bottom. And then the thumb, if we tuck it in here in the middle, is the limbic system. And first defined as the brain's neural network for emotion in 1937. And then it's been talked about so much, and there are debates about what exactly makes up the limbic system, or even if it is a specific system. But as an easier way to discuss the brain, we do talk about it this way with very specific parts, okay? So the diencephalon, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus, the amygdala and the hippocampus are very big parts of it that we discuss for stress, the pituitary gland, and the cingulate gyrus. So these are the different parts that we'll talk about with the limbic system. Then if you put your hand, your fingers down, all of this is the neocortical level. It's what we call very technically that thinky brain, 6-layered. It has all the wrinkles when you look at the brain called convolutions that carry 2/3 of the cortex within those folds. So without those folds, it could be 6¼ square feet. It'd be very big. That all those folds allow us to have a lot more information stuffed into that brain. It's very involved in sensory processing and in cognition. So a lot of those sensory centers are in that neocortex, as well as our prefrontal cortex, which is in the front here, behind the eye, between the eyes, behind the forehead, for a lot of our higher level thinking, kind of the newest part of the brain. All right, let's dig in. This is just a map of them, showing you the brain and where those things are, what they look like. You can look at this more in just the PowerPoint if you want. So piece by piece, let me move myself over here. The reticular, at first the vegetative level. I'll do one level per video. Reticular activating system, or the reticular formation, is a bundle of neurons consisting of about 90 different nuclei. It runs to the middle of the brainstem to the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So it goes kind of up the brainstem to the midbrain. That's how it connects kind of the body to the mind, moves sensory and motor information up and down between the thalamus and the hypothalamus, or the diencephalon, and the body. So it's moving information up from the body to those parts of the brain, and down from the brain and into the body. Sensory info moves sensory info from the body periphery moves upward, so information is flowing upward through it to the thalamus, where it's then gated to determine if it's important enough to move into the neocortex and all those sensory centers. The hypothalamus then sends information down through it to the brainstem and the body to activate and mediate fight or flight. And we'll talk a lot about the hypothalamus. It has a big role in fight or flight, and so it's going to use that. It's kind of like a tunnel. It's kind of like I don't know, the subway in which all this information is carried up and down the body between the mind and the body. Controls the sleep-wake cycle and level of attention when awake and sends signals to the cortex to wake it from sleep. So it would be very important if you need to wake from sleep because some sensory information has become important enough for you to wake the heck up. Okay, so this is just a summary. Plays a role in sending signals upward from the body to the diencephalon and higher areas for arousal to wake you up when stressful stimuli are encountered, and then sends the signals downward through the brainstem to the organs and skeletal system to activate fight or flight. So it's pretty darn important when it comes to our stress system. Oh, I'll talk about that in a second. So then in the vegetative level, we have the medulla oblongata, which controls automatic processes like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration. Thank goodness we don't have to think about all those. But when we do manage our breathing, then we are kind of getting in the center of that. Pons means bridge in Latin. It's located above the medulla and below the midbrain. It sends information between the cortex and the cerebellum, coordinating and controlling motor movement. So the cerebellum is very much about our motor movement, and so the pons is a bridge between that and other higher parts of the brain, coordinating our ability to move. Part of the pons, so this is a quote, part of the pons, the locus coeruleus, has the largest collection of norepinephrine-containing neurons in the central nervous system, which is very important to our stress response system. These neurons leave the locus coeruleus and project through the brain and the spinal cord. So they originate there, but then they project outward throughout the brain and spinal cord. Activity is low during sleep and high during states of arousal, especially like during stress. So it plays a part in breathing regulation, which is going to be important. Our breathing speeds up when we're under stress so that we can fight or fly and get enough oxygen. Also believed to be the origin of REM sleep when dreaming takes place. Busy, busy, busy area. Now, I do have, and these are all in the module for this week, some of these two-minute neuroscience tapes on these different parts of the brain, which I suggest watching to just sort of further explain, maybe better than me, what these different parts of the brain do. So check those out. Okay, still on vegetative level, the mesencephalon, or the midbrain, coordinates voluntary motor and sensory activities, including auditory and visual systems. Contains the substantia nigra, which is part of this, contains 3 out of the 4 of the brain's main dopamine tracks. So dopamine, so the substantia nigra sends signals down the spinal cord to control the muscles of the body. And dopamine, its main neurotransmitter, is made by the cells of this. Dopamine is thought of as the feel-good neurotransmitter, as it can elevate mood and combat stress effects. It plays a large role in the reward system. It plays a role in forming episodic memory and a key role in regulating motor movement. Death of the dopamine-producing cells is a major contributor to Parkinson's disease. That's why the motor movements are inhibited during Parkinson's. So it's going to be very important that, the dopamine system becomes important, one, in movement, not just in feeling good and mood, which can help us on the other end of stress and its effects, but also in helping to motivate for movement and manage and control our movement when we need it for fight or flight. So I'm going to stop here with this one, and then we'll move on to the limbic system.